They were dividing my house before I was even in the ground. I know that sounds dramatic. I am not a dramatic woman. I have lived 68 years of ordinary life, cooking meals that were eaten without thanks, washing clothes that were piled without thought, sitting at the edge of things so others could sit at the center. I know what drama looks like. This was not drama. This was a Tuesday afternoon in my own kitchen, and I was standing on the other side of the door. I had come downstairs for tea. My son Richard, my oldest, the one I pushed into the world first, the one whose head I held over a bowl when he had the stomach flu at age 9, was talking to his wife Sandra. They did not know I was there. The carpet on the stairs is thick. It was always thick. Harold picked it out himself. He said a quiet house was a peaceful house. Harold had been gone 11 months. The market in this neighborhood has gone up significantly, Richard was saying. His voice had the tone he uses in meetings. I have heard it at family dinners when he talks about his portfolio. Controlled, flat, like numbers on a page. If we list before spring, we're looking at a real return. We'd have to convince her, Sandra said. She'll be reasonable. She always is. That sentence sat in my chest like a stone. She always is. I stood on the other side of that door for perhaps 30 seconds. Then I turned around and went back upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed Harold and I had shared for 41 years, and I looked at my hands. 71 years old, and my hands still remembered everything. Kneading dough, buttoning small coats, pressing a cool cloth to a small forehead. I looked at them for a long time. I did not cry. I have never been the type to cry quickly. I was not raised that way, and life did not teach me otherwise. What I did instead was think, and I thought very carefully. Let me tell you about my children, because you need to understand them the way I understand them. Not the way a mother softens things, but the way a mother who has watched carefully for 50 years truly sees. Richard is 62 years old. He is the kind of man who calls himself practical when he means ruthless, and logical when he means cold. He married Sandra 24 years ago, and she is, I will be fair, not a cruel woman, but she is a careful one. She says the right things in the right moments. She brings me flowers when she wants something and brings me nothing when she doesn't. I noticed this pattern about 12 years ago. I said nothing. My daughter Patricia is 58. She is what people call sweet. She smiles and agrees and then disappears when things become uncomfortable. Her whole life she has chosen the path that causes her the least friction. I do not blame her entirely. Some people are built that way. But sweetness that never takes a stand is not really sweetness at all. It is just avoidance dressed nicely. My youngest is Martin. He is 54. He has made mistakes, money mistakes, relationship mistakes, the kind of mistakes that embarrass a family quietly. But Martin is the only one of the three who ever sat with me at the kitchen table at midnight and talked about nothing, who ever called just to hear my voice. His flaws are visible. That makes him more honest than the other two, I think, even when he is wrong. Harold left behind a house, 2 rental properties, some savings, and a life insurance policy. Together it was not a fortune, but it was enough to matter. It was enough to turn my children into people I was beginning not to recognize. I want to be honest about what I felt in those first weeks after I heard Richard in the kitchen. I felt something cold open in my chest. Not grief, I was already grieving Harold. This was different. This was the feeling of seeing something clearly that you had been trying not to see for a long time. Like when the fog finally clears. And you realize you have been standing at the edge of a cliff. I kept my face the same. I served meals. I asked about grandchildren. I listened to Sandra talk about kitchen renovations with the exact same expression I had always worn. But I started paying attention differently. I began keeping a small notebook. It sounds almost foolish to say that, a grandmother with a notebook. But I wrote things down, dates, words, small moments. I have always trusted my memory, but I am 71 years old and I understood that if things were going to matter later, I needed evidence that did not depend only on my recollection. The first thing I wrote down was Richard's comment about the house. The second thing I wrote down was something Patricia said 3 weeks later. She came by on a Sunday. She brought a casserole, which she does when she is about to say something she has practiced. We sat in the living room and she talked about nothing for 20 minutes, the grandchildren, a trip she was planning, something about her neighbor, and then she said, very gently, "Mom, have you thought about what you want to do with the house long term?" Because we just want to make sure you're comfortable. It's a lot of space for one person. A lot of space for one person. I looked at her. She smiled. The smile was warm and completely rehearsed. I'm comfortable, I said. Of course, she nodded quickly. Of course you are. We just want to make sure you've thought about options. Richard knows someone who does senior housing assessments. No pressure, just options. I wrote that down too. Senior housing assessments. No pressure, just options. Options meant they had already made a plan. Options meant the plan involved me not being here. I want to tell you about the rental properties because that is where I saw the second piece of the picture come together. Harold owned 2 small houses on the east side of town. They have been rented for years. Reliable income. He managed them himself until he got sick, and then I managed them. I know the tenants by name. I know when rent is due, and I know how to call a plumber. About 2 months after Patricia's visit, Richard called and asked me very casually, between sentences about his golf game, if I had thought about putting the rental properties into a joint account. For convenience, he said. So the family could help manage things. So I wouldn't have the burden. That word again. Burden. I'll think about it, I said. I did not think about it. I wrote it in my notebook and then I went to make tea. The thing is, they were not wrong that I needed help. I am 71 years old. I live alone. The house is large and the properties require attention, and Harold handled most of the financial paperwork, and yes, there were mornings when I sat at his desk and looked at documents I only half understood and felt frightened. They knew this. They were counting on it. That is where I could have made the mistake. There was a Sunday in February, 3 months after Harold died, when Richard came by with a folder. He sat at the kitchen table with me and he laid out papers that looked very official, and he said he had spoken to a financial advisor, his financial advisor, and that this arrangement would simplify things enormously. He explained it in terms I was supposed to find confusing and then reassuring: joint asset management, consolidated accounts, easier for everyone. I read the first 2 pages. My hand was on the pen. I put the pen down. Let me look this over more carefully, I said. My eyes aren't what they were. Richard nodded and said, of course, take all the time I needed. But his eyes went to Sandra across the kitchen. A quick look. The kind of look that said she's being difficult. I was not being difficult. I was saving myself. That night I drove to the pharmacy, bought a reading magnifier, and read every page of that document twice. I did not understand all of it, but I understood enough. Joint management in the manner described would have given Richard significant control over asset decisions. It was not illegal. It was carefully written to look like help. It was drafted by his lawyer. I put the papers in the drawer and I did not sign them. The following Monday morning I called a lawyer. Her name is Margaret Chen. I found her myself. I used the computer in the library, which my granddaughter had taught me to use 2 years ago for exactly this kind of research. I looked for attorneys who specialize in elder law and estate planning. I did not call the first name. I called 3 and I asked each of them the same questions. And I chose the one who answered most clearly and who did not speak to me like I was confused. Margaret Chen spoke to me like I was a woman making a decision. I met with her on a Thursday. I wore my good coat. I brought Harold's original will, the deed to the house, the documents from the rental properties, the papers Richard had given me, and my notebook. I set everything on her desk and I said, I need to understand exactly what I have and exactly what I can do with it, and then I need to make sure that what I decide cannot be undone without my knowledge. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, let's start from the beginning. We met 5 times over the next 3 months. I want you to understand that this was not quick. It was not simple. There were mornings I came home from her office with a headache from trying to hold all the information. There were evenings when I sat at Harold's desk and went through documents slowly, making notes in the margins. I asked her to explain the same thing twice when I did not understand it the first time. I was not embarrassed about that. Understanding is more important than appearing to understand. Between our meetings, I continued my life exactly as before. I had Sunday dinners. I answered the phone when my children called. I let Sandra show me pictures of kitchen renovations on her phone, and I said the right things about cabinet finishes. But I was listening. In March, I found the group chat. My granddaughter, Emily Martin's daughter, 16 years old and always leaving her phone on my counter, had a notification appear while we were baking. It came from a group called Family Planning, and the message was from Richard, and it said, "Has anyone talked to her about the Hartwell property? She won't bring it up herself, but we need to move on this before summer." Emily grabbed the phone quickly. She looked up at me. I was measuring flour, more or less than a cup. I asked her. "More," she said quietly. I did not make her feel guilty. She is 16 and she did not put herself in that situation. But I memorized what I had seen, word for word. I wrote it in my notebook that night. The Hartwell property was the better of the two rentals. Fully occupied, new roof 3 years ago. Harold always said it was the most solid investment he ever made. They wanted to move on it before summer. I called Margaret the next morning and told her what I had seen. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think we need to move faster." We had 3 more meetings after that. In those meetings we built something that I think Harold would have respected. Harold was a quiet man, but he was not a passive one. He made his decisions slowly and he made them well. I tried to think about what he would have done if he had known what I knew. Here is what we built. Margaret helped me establish a revocable living trust. Everything went into it: the house, both rental properties, the savings accounts, the investments. The trust named me as the sole trustee while I am living and competent. I chose a successor trustee who was not one of my children. Margaret helped me identify a local trust company. For this purpose, professional, accountable, not emotionally complicated. We had a doctor's appointment arranged. Margaret suggested this herself to document my cognitive and physical competency. My physician, Dr. Okafor, whom I have seen for 14 years, conducted a thorough assessment. He wrote a letter. I kept the original and gave a copy to Margaret. It stated clearly that I was of sound mind and full capacity to make my own legal and financial decisions. I also sold the Hartwell property. I want to be honest about how this decision felt. It was not easy. Harold had loved that property, but I understood that leaving it as it was invited a fight after I was gone. Instead, I sold it at full market value, through a proper agent, and used a portion of the proceeds to establish a charitable trust in Harold's name that supports the local library. Harold loved books. He would have approved. The remaining proceeds I distributed according to what I actually felt, not what the family expected. Martin received a portion not because he had behaved better than the others in recent months, but because I knew his life was harder and that he was, underneath everything, more honest with me. I set aside funds for each grandchild's education, placed in separate accounts that go directly to them when they turn 21. No parent can touch those funds. The house I kept. I am not leaving my house until I am ready to leave it. The second rental property I kept in the trust. The income it generates will fund my care, my comfort, and my decisions for as long as I live. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Martin about 6 weeks before the lawyer meeting. He called me late, not unusual for him, and he sounded tired. He said, "Mom, can I ask you something honestly?" "You always could," I said. "Are you okay?" "I mean actually okay, because Richard keeps calling about the properties and I don't know, something feels wrong." I thought about how to answer. "Martin," I said, "have I ever done anything that didn't make sense to you eventually?" He was quiet. Then he laughed a little. "No, then trust me a little longer." He said, "Okay." He said he loved me. I said I loved him too, and I meant it. The will reading was scheduled for a Tuesday in October. Margaret handled everything. She sent the formal notices to all 3 children requesting their presence at her office. Official letterhead. She kept the reason vague: estate matters requiring family presence. They all assumed it was routine, a formality. Richard arrived first. He was wearing his navy suit. He brought Sandra, which I had expected. Patricia came next, a little breathless, apologizing for traffic. Martin came last, alone, still wearing his work jacket, a smudge of something on his sleeve. He caught my eye across the room and gave me a small nod. Margaret's office is not a dramatic space. It has bookshelves and a large table and a window that looks out at a parking structure. Not romantic or cinematic, just a room where decisions are made. She welcomed everyone and offered water, which only Martin accepted. Then she asked everyone to be seated. I sat at the far end of the table. I had my hands folded in my lap. I had worn my blue dress, the one Harold said made me look like myself, whatever that meant. I thought I understood it now. Margaret began by outlining the basics, Harold's original will, the straightforward provisions he had made, which were modest and uncomplicated. Richard was already nodding slightly, the way he does when he thinks he knows the outcome of a meeting. Sandra was watching Margaret carefully. Patricia had her hands around a pen she wasn't using. Then Margaret said, however, in the period following Harold's passing, your mother undertook a comprehensive review of her own estate and legal standing, and made a number of independent decisions which I will now outline. Richard's nodding slowed. Sandra went still. Margaret began with the trust. She explained its structure clearly and without flourish. She explained that I was the sole trustee. She explained the successor arrangement with the trust company. She laid the documentation on the table. The rental properties, she continued, were both addressed separately. The Hartwell Avenue property was sold in August of this year. Net proceeds were distributed as follows. She read the distribution. I watched their faces. Richard's jaw tightened when he heard Martin's name. He looked at me. I looked back. The educational funds for the grandchildren, Margaret continued, are held in irrevocable accounts. They cannot be altered, redirected, or accessed by anyone other than the designated beneficiaries upon reaching age 21. Patricia looked up quickly. All the grandchildren. All 6, Margaret confirmed. The charitable trust in Harold's name. Margaret described it. The library. The endowment. I saw Sandra do a quick calculation in her eyes. I watched her realize that the number she had been expecting was simply not there. Then Margaret paused. She looked at me. There is one final matter, she said. Your mother has asked to say something directly. They all turned to me. Richard's expression was controlled, but there was something behind it I had not seen before. Something that looked like realizing you misjudged the distance. I did not have notes. I had lived with what I wanted to say. For 8 months. Richard, I said. I remember the day you started primary school. You cried at the gate and you did not want me to leave. I held your hand until the bell rang. I have spent 40 years trying to make sure you never had to be afraid. He did not move. I heard you in the kitchen, I said. 11 months ago. You and Sandra, talking about listing the house. I was coming down for tea. Sandra looked at the table. I also saw the group chat message about moving on the Hartwell property before summer. I said it simply, no accusation in my voice, just the facts. Laid out the way you lay silverware on a clean cloth. Patricia made a sound, small, like something releasing. I am not angry, I said. And I meant it not as forgiveness, not yet, but as truth. The anger had burned through me in January and February, and by the time the daffodils came up in March it had become something quieter and more useful. Clarity. I am telling you this so you understand that what you see in these documents is not confusion or manipulation. It is a decision made by a woman who was paying attention. Martin was looking at the table. His shoulders were curved slightly. He looked like the boy he used to be. I love all 3 of you, I said. That has never changed and it will not change. But love is not the same thing as unlimited access to what I have built. Your father and I built it together and I intend to be the one who decides what happens to it. I folded my hands again. That is what I wanted to say. The room was quiet in a way that rooms very rarely are. Richard was the first to speak eventually. He said, Mom, I want you to know I never meant to make you feel I know what you meant, I said gently. And I know what you didn't mean to show me. He stopped. We sat for a moment longer. Margaret asked if there were questions about the documents. There were a few practical ones, mostly from Richard, who had recovered enough to try to be systematic. I let Margaret answer them. When we left the office it was in the afternoon. The parking lot was ordinary. Yellow painted lines, a few pigeons, the kind of light that October makes when it is thinking about being winter. Martin waited until the others had gone to their cars. He came and stood beside me. I didn't know the extent of it, he said. I know. I should have said something sooner, when I started noticing things. Maybe, I said. But you called me. You asked if I was okay. That was enough. He hugged me. He is not a practiced hugger, he never was, and it was slightly awkward and genuine, and I held on for a moment longer than was comfortable because I wanted to. Patricia called me 3 days later. She was crying. She said she was sorry, that she had felt pressured by Richard, that she had told herself she was just trying to be practical, that she could see now how it had looked. I listened. I said I understood. I did not tell her that understanding is not the same as forgetting. She needed to hear that I understood. That was what I could give her. Richard has not called. It has been 2 months. Sandra sent a Christmas card with a brief, careful note inside. I read it once and put it away. I do not know what Richard will decide to do with his feelings about this. I am not waiting to find out. I have groceries to buy and a garden that needs attention before the ground freezes and a good book that Margaret recommended when we were finished with all of it. She said, "You should read something that has nothing to do with any of this." She was right. I want to talk to you now, whoever you are, listening to this, because I think you may have come to this story for a reason. Maybe you have children who have started speaking about you in a new way, a way that feels slightly less like love and slightly more like management. Maybe you have felt yourself becoming smaller in the conversations of people who are supposed to care for you. Maybe you have been waiting the way I waited for someone to tell you that what you are sensing is real. It is real. Here is what I learned. First, your independence is not a burden on others. It is yours. You built it. You maintained it. The fact that you are aging does not transfer ownership of your decisions to anyone else. Not your children. Not your grandchildren. Not anyone who positions themselves as a helper. There is a difference between accepting help and surrendering control. Learn to see that line clearly and hold it. Second, love and self-interest are not always opposites, but they are not always the same thing either. People who love you can also want things from you. Both of those things can be true at the same time, and you are allowed to see both of them at once. You are not being uncharitable by noticing when someone's concern for you has a shape that happens to benefit them. You are being honest. Third, your legacy belongs to you as long as you are living. Do not give it away early to avoid discomfort. The discomfort of a hard conversation is much smaller than the discomfort of realizing too late that you handed your life's work to people who did not value it the way you did. Plan intentionally. Find a lawyer you trust, one who speaks to you clearly. Take your time. Bring a notebook. And last, you are allowed to be both kind and firm. You do not have to choose between being a loving mother and being a woman with boundaries. I have not stopped loving my children, but I have stopped arranging my life around managing their disappointment. That shift, small as it sounds, changed everything. Harold used to say that the quietest people in a room were usually the ones who had thought the most. I think about that now when I sit in my living room in the evenings. My house is still mine. I can hear the floorboards settle. I know every sound this house makes. I am not in any hurry, and I am not afraid. If they thought that the woman coming down for tea was someone they could move through like furniture, well, they know better now. We all do.